Good morning. So Mary asked me to speak on justice or injustice in the borderlands in education. So there's a lot to say on this topic. This subject of justice, or lack thereof in education, is one I feel very strongly about, as I have been teaching social studies and language arts to 4th through 8th grade students in the borderlands for the past 16 years in Tucson and Naco, Arizona. In the last 2 years, I've gotten my master's in teaching English as a second language in order to better teach the many students I have had whose primary language is not English. I will address 3 aspects of injustice in the borderlands. Creating a system of funding schools through property taxes has based the school system on economic inequality and segregation. Schools located in poor neighborhoods receive less funding than schools in wealthy neighborhoods. Living in the borderlands, or in New York, Florida, Wyoming, or anywhere else in the United States, the quality of the school is affected by the funding it receives. Teachers at schools in lower income neighborhoods often receive lower pay and have more pressure for test scores that are not only affected by what happens in the classroom, but also by mobility, nutrition, parents' educational levels, violence, health, learning a second language, working outside of school to help supplement meager family incomes, etc. Higher quality teachers and teachers with more experience are harder to attract to schools in poor neighborhoods. And a personal example is when I moved from Tucson to work down here, I received $10,000 less in pay. Wow. How are Arizona state educational policies affecting this divide? I believe the current policy in regards to students whose primary language is not English or English language learners is discriminatory towards these students, does not follow best research practices in regards to students learning English, and therefore widens this divide. In 2000, Arizona voters passed Proposition 203, or English for the Children, replacing many bilingual programs with structured English immersion programs. In 2007, HB 2064 was passed regarding the implementation of the statewide structured English immersion model, requiring that English language learners must receive a minimum of 4 hours a day of English language instruction. 4 hours of English a day comes at a cost of sometimes losing math, social studies, or science classes. This means there is a cost of losing any background information building, which also leads to language building. For example, I have had 6th grade ESL students who did not know the difference between a city, a state, and a country in English or in Spanish. In a study completed in July of 2010 by Arizona State University, there were many disturbing results from the current structured English immersion policy. 9 schools from 5 districts participated in this study. Arizona law requires English language learners to be grouped together in a structured English immersion setting. This grouping is determined by their scores on the umbrella test. This has resulted in these students having very little to no time interacting with English proficient peers. The first finding in the study was that these students develop an identity as an ELL student and also do not have the benefit of improving their English by practice with native or proficient English speakers. This is true from my experience. My students at NACO often would say demeaning things about themselves associated with this identity. We're too stupid to be in the regular classes, miss, etc. Another part of the policy is that books and instructional materials are in English, and all reading, writing, and subject matter are taught in English. It also states the curriculum of all English language learner programs shall incorporate the academic standards adopted by the board and shall be comparable in amount, scope, and quality to that provided to English proficient students. Also, not allowing students To use their primary language as a ladder to learn a new language can be detrimental. I cannot imagine how I would have learned Spanish without the English translation. This stifling of students' use of their first language stops students from being able to access their prior knowledge, the wealth of experience and culture they come into the classroom with and could use to transfer to learning English. This both stunts and dissuades learning. This policy's goal is for ELLs to become English proficient in a year. Research demonstrates that students need 5 to 7 years to become academically proficient in English. The 4 hours of English also prevents many ELL students from graduating from high school. They cannot get enough credits in other academic classes to fulfill the requirements for graduation. At times, ELL students have to incur the cost of summer school or night classes in order to satisfy the required course to graduate, as well as transportation costs. This 4 hours of English a day policy sets up these children for failure. The policy creates even more barriers that often lead to dropping out of school. As Arizona was once part of Mexico, there always has been a large number of people of Mexican descent living here. Spanish was spoken here long before English, as well as Hopi, Dene, Inde, and Tohono O'odham. The border was also very different 50 years ago, even 20 years ago. When I moved to Arizona about 20 years ago, there were only 3,000 Border Patrol to guard a 3,000-mile border between the U.S. and Mexico. Today, there are a little over 18,000 Border Patrol agents. 50 years ago, the border was fluid. People passed back and forth across the border to work on both sides. When I worked at NACO, the secretary there told me that when she was a girl, the line dividing the two countries was just a wire fence. Families have lived for generations in these border towns and are literally divided by the wall. The very crucible of economics and politics directly affects our kids who live on the border and what they both see and experience on an everyday basis. In my class, I did a writing project and asked my 5th grade students, "How are you affected by the wall? What do you think about it?" I picked a few of their answers to share with you a child's view of living in the borderlands. One student wrote, "The border affects me because my dad cannot cross and he really wants to see my nana, and my nana cannot cross because she doesn't have papers to come back. I only get to see my dad on the weekends and my mom has to stay with my nana during the week and can only go to see my dad on the weekends. And sometimes I have to go to my dad and my mom can't go because she is working." Another 5th grader wrote, "3 days ago I was showing my passport to the man and my friend said, 'Look, a Mexican man jumped over the fence and the Border Patrol man hit him with a stick. He hurt the man. I felt bad because the border man got the stick and hit him real hard on the side and on his back. Then he called for 3 more Border Patrol men and they came." Another example is, "Every day I have to walk across. It feels scary because if you forget your passport, you get sent back. My mom can cross, but my dad can't." These are just a few of the many children's voices that describe a world where violence is not an uncommon event to view, and where the effects of injustice affect them on a very personal level. It is part of their daily experience. They learn to accept what they or members of their families might be treated with violence, or will be unsafe based on whether they have papers or not, and that they must carry their documents at all times as a Mexican-American child. As an educator, I believe that education is the key out of poverty. Multiple studies have proven this time and time again. With a good education, the individual's health and wealth both increase. Justice is possible. The fact that the education system is funded based on the worth of houses within the neighborhood does not ensure a good education for all. In fact, the way the education is funded ensures a continued gap between the rich and the poor. The fact that students whose language is not English are discriminated against in the state of Arizona actually ensures the opposite. Race in this country is also linked to poverty. According to our impoverished view of educational research by David Berliner, new immigrants, African Americans, any Hispanics, particularly those among groups who live in urban areas, are heavily overrepresented in the group that suffer severe poverty. The united messages from these three examples of injustice are that children of color are given the daily message that they are not worth as much as students who are white. Our educational system should be lessening the divide between the rich and the poor instead of increasing it. If we change how our schools are funded, policies that affect ESL students, and look critically at our border policies, then we shall begin to seek the path for justice.